In this video, we will use Peak LE6 to publish a podcast to the iTunes Music Store. In order to publish your podcast to the iTunes Music Store, there's a few things that you will need first. First of all, you'll need the audio file of your finished podcast. Secondly, you'll need web space in order to host your podcast, and the FTP details for your web space in order to upload your file to that web space. And finally, you'll need an iTunes Music Store account in order to be able to submit your podcast to the podcast directory. Firstly, let's load up our podcast file. So we've pre-recorded an audio file that we wish to use to make our podcast. Then go to the File menu and select Publish Podcast. This will bring up the Publish Podcast dialog, which has got a lot of boxes to fill in. Podcasts are created from two files. There's the RSS feed, which is a text file that contains all the information about your podcast, and also the audio file. So each episode is a separate audio file and has an episode entry in the RSS file. So we need to create our main RSS feed. So this is where you would give your podcast a title. Let's call it Podcast Test. You give it an author, put in your website link, and a brief description. If you wish to have some keywords about your podcast, let's put those in now. Technology. Keywords must be separated by a comma. And this is the file name that we will create for the podcast. So this must be unique, and you will use it as the main RSS file for all the episodes of this podcast. For file names, you can't use any odd characters, exclamation marks, percentage signs and all that sort of thing, and it's best not to leave spaces. So you'll notice, because I've used two words here, I've joined them with an underscore. That's a nice safe way to make sure there's no mishaps. Don't put an extension on the end, so don't put .xml, even though it's an XML file. When the podcast is published, that extension will be added. In order to publish your podcast to the iTunes Music Store, you must have an iTunes Music Store account. You don't need to spend any money doing it, so it won't cost you a cent, but it's part of the procedure. You must have that. So this is where you will put in your iTunes Music Store name and your email address. I'll just use a dummy one for now. You can select up to 3 categories. So we will have software, how to, and gadgets. Then select a podcast advisory. In our case, this will be a clean podcast, so anyone can listen to it. Over on the right-hand side of the page, you will have your episode information. Again, you'll notice I just deleted the exclamation mark. For RSS feeds, it's best to avoid using odd characters. You can use underlines and hyphens, but other than basic punctuation, everything else can cause problems. Provide your descriptions. The iTunes summary is the information displayed about that particular episode, so it would be a synopsis of what you are actually publishing in that episode. And again, you have the option of selecting an advisory for this particular episode. The audio file name on the server can be anything you like, and when Peak uploads your audio file to the server, that will become the name, regardless of what you've actually titled it. So we'll call it Podcast Demo Episode 1. The link is the link to that file. Now for that, you actually do need to know the address that that file will be published to via FTP. In our case, for example, so because we're publishing it as an MP3, this audio file name becomes the last thing in the link. From here, you will select your host, and finally your username and password, and then the path that you will actually publish the file to. This must be a folder that already exists on your web server. If you don't have a specific path to put it in, you can just put it in the root directory. If you wish to submit the podcast to iTunes Music Store straight after publishing it, you can tick this box. However, I'd probably recommend to check your feed first and make sure there are no problems. So once we have this in order, simply click Publish. Peak will then encode your file as an MP3 and begin the upload process. Now Peak will automatically copy the URL of the RSS feed to the clipboard, so that then you can paste it into iTunes or whatever application you're using and test the podcast out. So the first thing we'll do is actually verify that our podcast's feed is correct by going to a website called feedvalidator.org. This is a great method of checking that there are no problems with any odd characters or spelling mistakes or any issues in your feed. So simply put in your address there, click on Validate. If you get congratulations, this is a valid RSS feed, then you've done everything correctly. Now if we go to iTunes, we can then go to the podcasts section, and by going to Advanced, Subscribe to Podcast, we can again paste our podcast's URL in there, and iTunes will then pick it up and subscribe to it. Once your podcast has been successfully subscribed, you can then listen to it. In the world of computer-based recording, we're always keen to try the latest. So every episode from this point onwards, once you're subscribed, will automatically be downloaded to your iTunes. The final step would be to add your podcast to the podcast directory on iTunes Music Store. Once you've tested it and successfully added it, you can then submit it. Paste your feed URL in and click on Continue. There's a process of approval. Once you've submitted your podcast, the iTunes team will then approve your podcast and you'll be notified by email. Once your podcast is approved, you'll be able to search your podcast in the iTunes Music Store directory.